The city was alive with noise, the kind that never truly faded, even as night gave way to morning. Cars rushed past each other in an endless race of horns and headlights, tall glass towers pierced the sky, and neon signs fought for attention among the shadows of progress. In the heart of this modern chaos stood a man who had mastered it all, a figure both admired and feared, Mr. Armin, a millionaire whose name echoed in boardrooms and business pages. He was the kind of man whose handshake could close deals worth billions, whose voice could decide the fate of entire companies. To many he was living proof that money was power, and power was the only language that mattered. Every morning, his chauffeur pulled the sleek black car in front of his mansion, and the gates opened silently as though bowing to his authority. Reporters often camped outside just to catch a glimpse of him leaving for work, sharply dressed, polished, unshaken. He was the image of success, the man who believed he had everything: wealth, influence, and a family protected by walls no outsider could breach. His pride wasn't just in his fortune, it was in the life he had built for his son Rian. The boy, barely 12, lived in a world many could only dream of: private tutors, the finest meals, and toys imported from across the globe. To Armin, his son was untouched by the struggles of ordinary people. He often told his associates, "My boy will never know what hunger feels like, never touch dirt with his hands, never sit with those who beg. He is meant for greatness, and greatness requires distance." Those words carried his conviction, but hidden within them was his fear. Fear of poverty, fear of weakness, fear of ever returning to the days when he himself once had nothing. He wore his pride like armor, shielding his son from the world as though protection could guarantee perfection. And yet, as the city buzzed outside his fortress-like home, something quietly brewed beyond his control. For while he believed his son's life was flawless, untouched by hardship, the boy's heart was restless. The wealth surrounding him felt more like a cage than a blessing. He watched from the car windows as children in worn-out clothes laughed freely on the sidewalks, their games needing no expensive gadgets, their smiles unbought. Something about their freedom pulled at him, though he never dared speak of it aloud. The narrator's voice lingers like a shadow in this tale, but destiny had planned a lesson for him that no money could buy. For soon, the millionaire who thought he had seen everything would stumble upon a sight that would unravel his pride, a sight that would shake his soul and remind him of truths buried beneath the weight of his riches. What he discovered on an ordinary day in the city would leave him, and everyone around him, utterly shocked. Rian, the son of the millionaire, grew up surrounded by marble floors, chandeliers, and polished silverware, yet within him lived a quiet ache he couldn't explain. His room was filled with toys from distant countries, the latest gadgets lined his shelves, and books arrived in stacks whenever he asked for them. Yet none of it gave him joy for long. He would sit by the wide glass windows of his mansion, pressing his forehead against the cool pane, watching the world outside. The street beyond the gates felt alive in ways his golden cage never did. There were children out there, dirty-faced, barefoot, laughing as though the cracked pavement beneath them was the most magical playground in existence. Their joy was unpolished but real, and Rian longed to know what it felt like. At school, Rian had classmates who looked at him not as a friend but as the son of a powerful man. They treated him with respect but never warmth. Teachers praised him for his intellect and discipline, but he knew their smiles were tinted with the awareness of who his father was. Every compliment felt hollow, every friendship conditional. Even at home, his conversations with his father were brief, practical, often laced with advice about ambition and discipline. His mother, though loving, was often busy with her own circle of social obligations. Rian felt like a prince in a kingdom of silence. On the other side of the same city, far from marble halls and luxury cars, lived a boy of the same age, but born into a world that seemed determined to break him. Kabir was his name, though few ever asked. He was an orphan, left to fend for himself after his parents passed away too early, their absence leaving a wound no riches could ever heal. Each morning, he woke on a ragged blanket beneath a half-broken shed, and his first thought was always survival. Where would he find food today? Would anyone share a crust of bread, or would he go to sleep hungry again? Kabir's world was harsh, yet he carried within him a wisdom that few children possessed. He had learned early that kindness was a currency stronger than coins. When he was lucky enough to find food, he would share it with other street children, tearing the small piece into halves or thirds, smiling as though he had more than enough. He spoke to the little ones like a teacher, showing them letters by scratching on the pavement with chalk stolen from dumpsters. A, he would say, and their small voices would repeat, A. His dream wasn't of toys or palaces, it was of knowledge, of learning, of lifting himself and others out of the shadows of hunger. The contrast between the two boys was striking, yet invisible threads already stretched between their worlds. Rian, rich but lonely, longed for genuine laughter. Kabir, poor but spirited, longed for opportunity. One boy was trapped in abundance, suffocated by a life too controlled, while the other was trapped in poverty, restrained by a life too unforgiving. And though they had never met, destiny was quietly stitching their paths together, preparing a meeting that would bridge the gulf of wealth and want. At night, as Rian lay on his soft mattress beneath a canopy of velvet curtains, he thought about the children he saw playing freely on the streets. He envied their laughter, the way they looked at each other with real affection, not guarded politeness. Meanwhile, Kabir lay on his thin blanket beneath the open sky, watching the stars blink above him, and wondered what it might feel like to sleep in a real bed. Both boys from two worlds apart closed their eyes with the same thought: there must be more to life than this. And though they didn't know it yet, their invisible bond had already formed. For soon Rian's restless heart and Kabir's unshaken spirit would collide in a moment so simple, yet so profound, that it would challenge the very walls the millionaire had built around his son's life. One warm afternoon, when the air shimmered with heat and the city moved lazily under the sun, Rian decided he could no longer remain behind the mansion's tall iron gates. He had watched for weeks, studying the routine of the guards, the habits of the maids, and the way the chauffeur parked the car after dropping his father at the office. That day, when the staff was busy with errands, he slipped out quietly, his small figure blending with the shadows of the garden until he reached the service gate. With a thudding heart, he pushed it open just enough to squeeze through, and for the first time, the city lay before him not as something to observe through glass but something to step into. The noise startled him at first: vendors shouting, rickshaws honking, the hum of a world alive in its imperfections. His polished shoes clashed with the dust beneath him, his neatly pressed shirt now clinging with sweat, but for the first time he felt free. He wandered with curiosity, eyes wide at the small shops, the crowded stalls, and the children chasing each other barefoot with sticks and tin cans as toys. He smiled at the sight, though they barely noticed him, too engrossed in their simple joy. Then, at the corner of a cracked pavement near an abandoned building, he saw him, the boy from the streets, Kabir. He was sitting cross-legged on the ground with a piece of stale bread in his hands. The bread was dry and hard, edges crumbling as he broke it slowly, carefully, as though every bite had to last. Around him sat two smaller children, even younger, their eyes fixed on the bread as if it were a feast. Kabir smiled faintly, broke the bread in 3 parts, and handed the pieces to the little ones first. They ate quickly, gratefully, crumbs sticking to their lips. Only when they were finished did he take a tiny bite for himself. Rian froze at the sight. He had eaten lavish meals all his life, soups prepared by chefs, meat carved by servants, desserts flown in from abroad, but never had he seen food treated with such reverence. His heart ached, and yet his feet moved toward the boy without his mind fully deciding. Kabir noticed him, his eyes narrowing at first with caution. To him, Rian's clean clothes and careful posture marked him as someone from a different world. But then, seeing the boy's hesitant smile, Kabir softened. "You hungry?" Kabir asked, his voice rough yet kind. Rian looked at the piece of bread in his hand, uncertain. Pride and shame collided inside him. He had never been offered something so little, yet so much. Kabir didn't wait for an answer. He broke the bread again, holding out a piece toward Rian. Rian's throat tightened. "But, it's yours," he whispered. Kabir shook his head, grinning faintly. "Food tastes better when shared." And with those words, Rian sat down beside him, his expensive trousers brushing against the dusty street. He took the bread, its texture rough against his fingers, and for the first time in his life, he ate something without a fork, without ceremony, without care for how it looked. The bread was hard, almost tasteless, but it felt alive in his mouth because of what it meant. The children giggled, amused by the sight of this rich-looking boy eating like them. Soon, laughter bubbled between them, soft at first, then louder, until it filled the corner of the street. Rian forgot the mansion, forgot the rules, forgot everything except the warmth of sitting in a circle with friends who wanted nothing from him but his presence. Kabir teased him gently about how awkwardly he held the bread, and Rian laughed until his stomach hurt, something he hadn't done in years. For a brief moment, the differences between them vanished. There was no millionaire's son and no beggar boy, only children sharing food, sharing laughter, sharing humanity. But destiny, as always, watched closely. A sleek black car rolled slowly down the street, its windows tinted, its presence commanding attention. Inside sat the millionaire's chauffeur, tasked with running errands before returning to fetch his employer. As he waited at a traffic signal, his eyes wandered, and froze. There on the pavement was young Master Rian, sitting cross-legged on the dirt, laughing with a ragged beggar boy, breadcrumbs scattered around them. The chauffeur's heart raced. This was no ordinary mischief. This was scandalous in the eyes of his employer. He fumbled for his phone, hesitated, then clicked a picture before dialing the number he dreaded. His voice shook as he spoke. "Sir, you won't believe what I've just seen." And with that call, the laughter on the street had unknowingly set into motion a storm that would shake the walls of the millionaire's empire. The call came in the middle of a meeting. Mr. Armin sat at the head of a long glass table, surrounded by men in suits who nodded at his every word. The chauffeur's number flashed across the screen of his phone, and though he rarely tolerated interruptions, something in his gut urged him to answer. The voice on the other end was hesitant, trembling, but the words were clear enough to make his blood boil. "Sir, your son, he was sitting on the street with a beggar boy, eating bread, laughing with him." Armin's hand clenched the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. For a moment, silence hung in the boardroom as he processed what he had just heard. His eyes narrowed, his jaw hardened, and then he barked a sharp command to the chauffeur to return home immediately and bring his son with him if he saw him again in such a place. "How could my son eat with a beggar?" he spat, each word dripping with disgust. The men at the table shifted uncomfortably, sensing the fury that had overtaken their leader. That evening, Armin confronted Rian, his voice cold as steel. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you understand what it means when the son of a millionaire is seen sitting with a street rat?" His words struck like whips, but Rian's young eyes met his father's with quiet defiance. "He's not a rat," Rian whispered, his voice trembling but steady. "He's my friend." The audacity of those words ignited Armin's anger further, yet beneath that rage stirred a ghost from his own past. That night, long after he had locked himself in his study, Armin poured a glass of whiskey and stared into the darkness. Memories came uninvited, his own childhood on a dirt floor, the taste of stale bread, the shame of being mocked for torn clothes. He had clawed his way out of that life with fists and fury, swearing never to let poverty touch him again. The image of his son sitting where he once sat, eating the food he once ate, threatened to reopen wounds he had buried deep. He had built walls of wealth to ensure his child would never know that pain, and yet here was Rian, breaking through them as though they were nothing. The next day, determined to put an end to it, Armin ordered his chauffeur to follow Rian discreetly. And just as he feared, the boy slipped out again, drawn back to the streets like a moth to flame. When Armin arrived, his expensive shoes crunching against the dusty road, he saw it with his own eyes. Rian was there, sitting cross-legged beside Kabir, sharing another scrap of bread, laughing in a way Armin had never seen him laugh at home. Around them, a small crowd had gathered, passers-by who slowed to watch the curious sight of a rich boy among the poor. Some whispered, some smiled, and others raised their phones, recording the moment as though it were a spectacle. Shame burned Armin's face hotter than the noon sun. To him this was not innocence, it was humiliation. His name, his reputation, his empire could not be associated with such an image. With long strides he stormed forward, his shadow falling over the boys. The laughter died instantly. Rian looked up, startled, while Kabir's eyes widened in alarm. Without a word, Armin seized his son by the arm and yanked him to his feet, brushing the dust from his clothes as though it were poison. "What do you think you're doing?" Armin thundered, his voice booming over the street. "Do you know who you are? You are my son. And you dare to sit with this beggar?" His finger pointed at Kabir, his tone dripping with contempt. The crowd fell into a hush, some shaking their heads, others pitying the boy being insulted. Kabir stood silently, his small hands clutching the last piece of bread, his dignity bruised but his spirit unbroken. Rian's face crumpled. Tears welled in his eyes, not from fear of his father's anger but from the injustice of his words. "Stop it, father," he cried, pulling against the iron grip on his arm. "Don't talk to him like that. He's kinder than anyone in this city, kinder than anyone I know. He shared his food with me when he had nothing. You don't understand." The crowd murmured, touched by the boy's defense. A woman whispered, "Out of the mouths of children, truth is spoken." A man shook his head at Armin, disapproval etched on his face. But Armin, blinded by pride and rage, could only see betrayal. To him, his son was choosing shame over honor, poverty over wealth, weakness over strength. Yet the sight of Rian's tears, streaming down his cheeks as he clutched his friend's hand in defiance, pierced through the armor of arrogance that Armin had built around his heart. For the first time in years he saw not just his son, but a mirror of his own forgotten self. A boy who once knew hunger, who once sat on the dirt, who once dreamed of kindness in a cruel world. And though he refused to admit it, a crack had formed in his certainty. A storm brewed inside him, one that would not settle until he faced the truth he had spent his entire life running from. That night, sleep refused to come. Armin lay on his king-sized bed, the silk sheets smooth against his skin, but comfort felt like chains. His son's trembling voice replayed in his mind again and again. "He is kinder than anyone I know." The words had been simple, spoken through tears, but they carried the weight of a truth he couldn't ignore. They cut deeper than any insult, echoing louder than the honking of the city outside, louder than the silence inside his grand home. He turned onto his side, then onto his back, staring at the ceiling as if it might hold answers. But all he saw was Kabir's face, dusty, thin, yet filled with a quiet dignity that mocked his arrogance. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered the way Rian clutched that boy's hand as though it was worth more than every jewel in the mansion. And for the first time in years, doubt crept into the fortress of his certainty. By dawn he had made up his mind. If this boy had somehow captured his son's heart, he needed to know why. But not as a father seeking to understand, rather as a man accustomed to control. He called his chauffeur, instructing him to find the boy again, to follow him, to bring back every detail of his life. Armin wanted to see for himself what kind of child could so boldly stand in the presence of wealth and offer a piece of stale bread as if it were a treasure. The chauffeur returned later, hesitant but obedient, and reported what he had seen. The boy had no parents, no home, no family except the group of children who lingered around him. He begged when he had to, scavenged when he could, but what little he managed to gather was often shared, never hoarded. "Sir," the chauffeur said softly, almost ashamed to admit it, "when he finds food, he feeds others before himself. He sleeps on the bare ground, yet still smiles. He teaches the street kids their letters with broken chalk. I saw it with my own eyes." Armin dismissed him with a wave of his hand, but his heart pounded. Restlessness drove him from his office that afternoon. In a simple car without his usual entourage, he went himself. He didn't want second-hand words, he wanted proof. He parked at a distance and walked quietly, the expensive leather of his shoes out of place on the cracked sidewalks. Then he saw it. Kabir was sitting on the pavement, a circle of younger children gathered around him. His fingers were stained white with chalk dust, the stick so short it was barely more than a pebble. On the ground, shaky letters formed in uneven lines, EBC. The children repeated after him, their voices small but eager, their eyes shining with hope. Armin stood frozen, hidden in the shadow of a lamppost, watching. Kabir's voice carried no authority, no power backed by money, and yet the children listened as though he were their savior. When one little boy stumbled over a letter, Kabir smiled patiently, repeating it until the child got it right. The laughter that followed was soft, genuine, warm enough to fill 100 empty stomachs. Armin felt something tighten in his chest. He had paid the best tutors for his own son, had built a life of privilege, and yet his boy looked lonelier than these children did on a cracked pavement with nothing but chalk dust. He remembered his son's words again. "He is kinder than anyone I know." And standing there in silence, he realized they were true. It wasn't just kindness, it was resilience. Kabir, who had nothing, gave what little he had without hesitation. Kabir, who was denied education, still found a way to teach. Kabir, who slept hungry, still carried a smile. Armin lowered his gaze, shame washing over him like cold rain. He had spent years building towers of wealth, thinking they would shield him from the pain of his past, thinking they would buy respect, love, security. But here was a boy with nothing, and yet he held more strength, more wisdom, more humanity than all the riches Armin had piled up. For the first time in decades, the millionaire felt small. And though he didn't want to admit it, the boy on the pavement had taught him something his money never could, that the greatest wealth lay not in possession but in compassion. 4 days afterward, the image refused to leave Armin's mind. No matter how many contracts he signed or how many figures danced across his spreadsheets, all he could see was Kabir's thin hands holding a stub of chalk. All he could hear was his son's trembling voice. "He is kinder than anyone I know." Shame gnawed at him, sharper than hunger ever had in his youth. He had stood in the middle of the street and called a child a rat, forgetting entirely that once upon a time, he had been no different. The incident had not gone unnoticed. The videos people recorded spread quietly at first, shared among neighbors and strangers, until they reached social media. Clips of a millionaire dragging his son away from a beggar, contrasted with the boy's calm dignity and Rian's tearful defense, stirred the hearts of many. Comments began to appear. That street boy has more honor than the rich man, and true kindness is not measured by wealth. Even news outlets picked it up, not as headlines but as human interest stories. The public admiration for Kabir grew while Armin, though not openly named, felt the sting of being whispered about. Inside his own home, silence weighed heavier than any scandal. Rian refused to speak to him. At the dinner table, the boy kept his eyes on his plate, pushing food around without touching it. In the hallways he passed his father without a glance. For a man used to commanding respect with a word, the quiet rebellion of his own son pierced deeper than any insult from outside. One evening, Armin finally tried to break the silence. "Rian," he said, his tone softer than usual, "you don't understand the world yet. I was only trying to protect you." The boy lifted his head, his eyes red but fierce. "Protect me from what, father? From kindness? From friendship? From being human?" His voice trembled but grew stronger with every word. "What is wealth worth if we can't respect others? You think money makes us better, but it only makes us blind. Kabir has nothing, yet he gave me half his food. And you, with everything, couldn't give him a kind word." The word struck harder than any blow. Armin's throat tightened but no defense came. In that moment he saw his son not as a child but as a mirror reflecting everything he had lost in his pursuit of success. He remembered the hunger that had once taught him empathy, the pain that had once made him value compassion. Somewhere along the path to wealth, he had buried those lessons beneath pride. That night, long after Rian had gone to bed, Armin sat in his study surrounded by the symbols of his triumph: paintings, awards, contracts worth fortunes, and for the first time they looked meaningless. What good was success if it built walls instead of bridges? What good was wealth if it made him smaller, not greater? He thought of Kabir again, teaching children with chalk, smiling through hunger, carrying dignity where others carried despair. The boy had no fortune, no influence, yet he had touched his son's heart and reluctantly his own. By dawn, Armin had made a decision. He could no longer hide behind anger or pride. The memory of insulting that child in public was a wound that only humility could heal. He needed to face Kabir again, not as a man of power but as a man who had been wrong. He rehearsed in his mind what he would say, though the words felt clumsy: an apology, an admission, a request for forgiveness. The thought unsettled him, for he had bowed to no one in years. Yet something deeper than ego pushed him forward. The next morning he called his chauffeur. But this time, his instructions carried no arrogance, no orders of removal or punishment. "Take me to where the boy is," he said quietly, his voice almost uncertain. The chauffeur, surprised but respectful, nodded without question. As the car rolled through the city streets, Armin stared out the window. The billboards, the shops, the flashing lights, all the emblems of progress, seemed smaller now. His thoughts were fixed only on the cracked pavement where a boy once shared bread with his son, on the patch of ground where dignity and kindness had shamed him more than any insult ever could. And for the first time in a long time, Armin felt something new stir within him. Not anger, not pride, but humility. He was ready to meet the boy again, not to drag his son away, not to insult or scold, but to listen, to see, and perhaps to learn. The following day dawned brighter, though Armin's heart was still heavy with the shadows of guilt. He had rehearsed a dozen speeches in his mind, but when the car stopped near the cracked pavement where Kabir often sat, every word seemed to crumble. He stepped out, no longer the towering figure of authority but a man stripped of pride, walking slowly toward the boy he had once insulted. Kabir noticed him, stiffened at first, his eyes wary, ready to protect what little dignity he had left. Rian, who had insisted on coming along, ran ahead and stood by his friend's side, almost as if shielding him from his own father. Armin stopped a few paces away, breath uneven. For the first time in years he bowed his head slightly, his voice trembling. "Kabir," he began, struggling to force the words past the wall of his ego, "I was wrong." Silence hung between them, heavy as stone. "I insulted you when I should have respected you. I judged you for having nothing when in truth you have more than I ever did: courage, kindness, wisdom. I came today not as a millionaire, but as a man asking for forgiveness." The street around them seemed to hush. Passers-by slowed, sensing something unusual. Rian's eyes widened, pride flickering in his gaze as he looked at his father, finally seeing humility where there had once been arrogance. Kabir swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. "I am only a boy," he said softly. "I have nothing to forgive. But thank you for seeing me." Tears threatened at the corners of Armin's eyes, but he steadied himself. "No," he said gently, You deserve more than my apology. You deserve a chance. If you'll accept, I want to help you study, to give you a home, to make sure you never have to beg again. Not because I pity you, but because I see who you are, and I believe in who you can become." Kabir blinked, his small frame trembling under the weight of those words. He had never imagined someone would offer him such a future. Rian reached out, grabbing his friend's hand. "Come with us," he said eagerly. "You're family now." That evening, the long dining table in the mansion looked different. No longer cold and quiet, it became a place of warmth. Kabir sat nervously at one side, but Rian beamed, proud to have his friend beside him. Armin, for the first time in years, felt joy not in the glitter of silverware but in the simple act of sharing food. He watched as Kabir and Rian laughed over a bowl of fruit, breaking bread not on the street but at his table. And he realized that the table felt fuller, his home richer, because humility had finally found a place there. The transformation did not end with one meal. In the weeks that followed, Armin turned his wealth toward building something more lasting than skyscrapers. He launched scholarships for street children, funded shelters and schools, and walked the same streets he had once ignored, no longer as a man above them but as one who understood. Each new project was not charity, it was a promise to his son, to Kabir, and to the child he once had been, a poor boy who knew the sting of hunger and the value of compassion. One evening, as the three of them sat together once more, Rian nudged Kabir and whispered, "See? I told you he would change." Kabir smiled shyly, his eyes shining. And Armin, hearing those words, felt a quiet peace settle in his heart. The beggar boy was no longer poor in spirit, no longer invisible. He had become part of something larger than fortune, he had become family. And in that moment, Armin understood the lesson destiny had carved for him. That true success was not in the empire he had built, but in the lives he touched, the respect he gave and the love he received in return. In the quiet after the storm, when the city had resumed its rhythm and the whispers of scandal had faded into memory, something far more lasting remained. Armin found himself walking not ahead of his son, not towering above Kabir but beside them both. The path that had once separated his mansion from the dusty streets had narrowed, until it became a single road they could walk together. And in that walk, Armin discovered a truth he had once buried beneath layers of wealth and pride. The narrator's voice would linger softly, almost like a prayer carried on the wind. "True wealth is not in gold or silver, but in the hearts we touch and the kindness we share." For Armin, this was no longer just a poetic phrase. It was lived experience. The empire he had built with contracts and profits seemed fragile compared to the strength of a boy who had nothing yet gave everything. The respect he had once demanded with authority felt hollow compared to the love that grew naturally between his son and Kabir. He had spent his life chasing treasures the world could measure, forgetting that the greatest treasure could not be counted, only felt. In the days that followed, Armin opened new doors, not only for Kabir but for others like him. He supported schools for street children, not as charity, but as acknowledgement of their worth. He invited Kabir into his home, not as a guest of pity but as part of the family's circle. Rian, once lonely despite luxury, found in Kabir a brother. Together they played, learned and dreamed, one teaching resilience, the other offering hope. But the transformation was not one-sided. Kabir too carried the change within him. No longer did he walk the streets as an invisible shadow. He was seen, respected, valued. The boy who once drew letters on the pavement with chalk now held books in his hands, yet his humility never wavered. He reminded the millionaire's family every day that wisdom grows not from wealth, but from struggle and kindness. The closing scene would be painted like a cinematic tableau, the three of them walking together through a park, the city skyline behind them glowing in the golden light of sunset. No chauffeur drove them this time, no crowd watched in judgment. It was simply a father, a son, and a boy once thought too poor to matter, all smiling, all equal. The millionaire's hand rested gently on Rian's shoulder, while Kabir walked freely at his side. In their laughter there was no trace of status, no barrier of pride. The narrator's voice would return one last time, wrapping the story in its final truth. Children teach us what we forget, humanity is the greatest treasure. In their innocence, they remind us that no wealth can surpass the gift of kindness, no empire can outlast the power of love. And so the story closed not with riches counted or titles earned, but with a lesson learned. A reminder that even the proudest hearts can be softened, even the wealthiest hands can learn to give, and that sometimes it takes the smallest voices to awaken the deepest truths. Word count, 714.